Welcome back to the Lore and Valor podcast. I'm your host, Justin Watson. Today I'm trying a new type of segment for shows that I've watched, but I don't think I'll end up going through an episode by episode review the way we're doing with Arcane or Moon Knight, because they were good shows, but not shows that I need to rewatch every single episode and provide commentary on. I'm calling it the Hot Wash AAR. In the Army, the hot wash is the after-action review you do right at the end of the exercise while you're still in the field, just standing around the back end of an armored personnel carrier or around a table. So first up is DOTA, Dragon's Blood, and as always, spoilers when I talk about movies or TV. So I will spoil some of this show. I'm not going to do a blow-by-blow, but I will talk about things that are sort of reveals. So DOTA Dragon's Blood is a adult animated fantasy series that is an adaptation of a Blizzard game that I've never played before, so I can't comment on any problems or virtues of adaptation in the show. It is interesting to note, though, that this is the second Netflix animated adaptation of a video game I've watched that hasn't entirely sucked, so that's cool. Maybe this is a renaissance of video game adaptations. It's not as good as Arcane, though. The genre of the show is pretty classical Tolkien-derived fantasy, which is not an insult. Most Western fantasy is Tolkien-derived, and I love a lot of it, particularly if you're like me and you grew up reading Dragonlance and 80s and 90s fantasy novels. The tropes in this show are going to be pretty familiar to you, and those tropes are near and dear to my heart. So in this show, you have a dragon knight as your main protagonist, Davion, who's, as it's implied, a dragon slayer primarily. You have a deposed princess of a far-off kingdom with mystical powers, maybe. You have a crazy powerful wizard who is toying with the forces of reality itself and cutting Machiavellian deals with demons and dragons in order to avenge himself upon a goddess. You have machinations that will affect the courses of kingdoms and family drama and romantic subplots, and it's all great stuff. But to get to my one real negative, everything is packed in here. So, as I mentioned, you have your classic Dragonlance tropes, and Tolkien tropes properly. Sorry. I read Dragonlance as my first series of fantasy novels. I love them dearly, but I know most people, the classic fantasy author is Tolkien. Excuse me. So you have your classical fantasy tropes, and then you also have some Witcher-esque racial tensions between elves and humans that feel very morally gray and complex. But the problem is, you only have, between the two seasons that have been released so far, 16 45-ish minutes episodes, and it feels rushed. Like, it just does. Nothing is given enough time to breathe. Relationships progress way too quickly. Sometimes it feels like you're watching a really good story, but on fast forward sometimes. So that doesn't ruin it for me, but it does knock it down a peg overall from where it would be. In terms of writing and storytelling. The show's animation style overall really impresses me. It works for me, especially in most of the creature design. There are a multitude of dragons here. Dragons are my favorite fantasy creature. Most of them are really freaking cool, although a few of the elder worms, the most ancient dragons of this setting, are a little over the top, I think, in an effort to make them look unique. And some of the main characters, when the animators drew their noses, it's weird. It's like they were going for shading off the side of the nose. Shading off the side of the nose. But instead of a shade, it's like a line. It's weird. And lastly, as a matter of personal taste, they do the trope with oversized or impractically designed weapons that if you actually tried to wield them, you'd probably chop yourself to bits. It's not my favorite thing, but I do recognize that it's a genre convention in anime and accepted. So didn't bother me that much, but if you don't like that sort of thing, it's there. Another interesting thing here is there's lineage from the cartoon Avatar: The Last Airbender and its successor series, Legend of Korra, as well as Netflix's offerings, Voltron, Legendary Defender, the new Voltron, not the classic 80s Voltron, and Dragon Prince, the more recent one. I found that interesting in that I saw a lot of shared names between the production and writing teams, and you can definitely get that sense from the animation, some of the humor, and the storytelling. What cued me in to actually look at the names was that Benjamin Kalternecker was listed as a producer for this show, and he was also a producer on Voltron. Their pet cow in Voltron was named after Kalternecker. So that's another good show. I should talk about that at some point too. Do a video on that. Anyway, the point being, like, there's a lot of lineage there, but this is definitely aimed at adults solely. Avatar with somewhat more mature subject material than you might usually get in a kid show, but they were still kid shows. This is definitely an adult show. There is graphic violence, including the murder of innocents. There is heavily implied, though not graphically depicted, sex. There's a fair number of bad language words, so it's not for kids. Be warned about that. The voice cast is all on point, but really the standout is the magnificent Tony Todd, who voices Slyrak, the Elder Worm of Fire. And why no one has cast Tony Todd as a dragon before is beyond me, because he voices this immense red dragon with such ferocity and majesty that he basically carries the show by himself sometimes. If you're not familiar with the name Tony Todd, fellow geeks will recognize him as Worf's brother Kern from Star Trek The Next Generation and Star Trek Deep Space Nine. He's also been a character actor in a bunch of other movies. He was one of the mercenaries in The Rock, the classic 90s action movie. So yeah, overall, really enjoyed it. Thought the dragons were super cool. All the different variants they had in there with their different breath weapons and personalities and machinations. Little too rushed. In the end, I give this show a recommendation if you're like me and you love classic fantasy tropes and you want more of them. This is a competent, valuable contribution to the field, in my opinion. But if knights, dragons, elves, wizards aren't really your wheelhouse, this isn't going to be the show that converts you to becoming a fan of fantasy. So that's all I have for now. See you next time, and until then, keep up the fire.